Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our Introduction to Biblical Studies course. Today we have come to Singapore. We're in Southeast Asia. Appropriate because Singapore is such a modern city. The Catholic Church came here due to the mission work of especially French missionaries in the 19th century. And today we're going to be talking about modern exegesis. We're going to be talking about exegesis after the Protestant Reformation. Let's go ahead and look at our agenda for today. We're first going to look at what differentiated the modern era from the medieval era that preceded it. We're also going to look a little bit at even what differentiates the pre-Reformation church from the post-Reformation church. Then we're going to delve into some of the different developments within exegesis, especially during the Enlightenment. And then we'll look at how both Catholics and Protestants responded to these new questions that arose during this era. But first, let's take a step back. Let's look at the history of the modern world. We talked about this in our last class, about the difference between the medieval era and the Renaissance and Reformation eras. These trends that began in the 15th and 16th centuries continue after the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent, you'll remember, was the ecumenical council within the Catholic Church that met between 1545 and 1563 that responded to the abuses and doctrinal controversies that led to the Protestant Reformation. As we look through the 17th century up even to the present day, I want to point out 5 specific changes that happened in the world. One was a massive development within language studies. We saw already that during the Renaissance, Greek came to a renewed interest in the West, as did Hebrew. Beyond Greek and Hebrew, the two principal biblical languages, more knowledge about Aramaic came. Also, with various archaeological discoveries that took place during these centuries, other languages such as Ugaritic, Akkadian, and Egyptian became better known. Even comparisons with Arabic began to be explored. All of these other ancient Near Eastern languages help enrich scholars' knowledge of the grammar that's used in the Hebrew Bible, the Greek Septuagint, and in the Greek New Testament. We also just have archaeology. For the first time during this era, we could know who the Philistines were from a source other than the Bible. All of these characters that had been heard about for centuries in the Bible, we now have direct evidence of them from sources that are sympathetic to them. So this supplemented our knowledge of the world that produced the Bible. Also, and more philosophically, we've gone since the time of the Renaissance from a world of monarchies, at least in Europe, to a world of democracies or constitutional monarchies. There's been a deeper suspicion of, you can see I write here, unfettered executive and legislative authority. So that suspicion of the Pope that we saw in the Renaissance era, it spreads to politics more generally. A deeper suspicion of unilateral authority and an increased emphasis on fundamental individual human rights. Within biblical exegesis, this led to an increased sympathy for people who seem to be unfairly portrayed, or at least are negatively portrayed in various biblical books. Also, technology. With the rise of technology, biblical research became easier to do and also much less expensive. Nowadays, a biblical interpreter can just sit in an office and within a few minutes do work that 50 years ago would have taken days and cost thousands of dollars doing research manually. And we have to also point out developments in natural science also colored how we interpreted the Bible. I'm thinking especially of evolution, but even something like radioactive decay, the relationship between matter and energy. All of these things made subtle changes to how we understand the Bible and challenged traditional interpretations. So how did scholars and other interpreters respond? Let's look at Enlightenment exegesis. As we mentioned earlier, the Council of Trent occurred, and then in the 17th century, you had the brutal European wars of religion, especially the 30 Years' War. This led to a suspicion of religion because it seemed to be causing so much conflict. This led many a well-intentioned person to look for another anchor besides pure faith in order to come to human knowledge. And all of this gives rise to the Enlightenment. Of course, the philosophy of René Descartes also had a role to play in all of this, but this new skepticism led to the exaltation of reason, often against faith. Moreover, politically, both the American Revolution and the French Revolution struck at the heart of monarchical authority, the idea of the divine right of kings. And so in this early Enlightenment era, you have different interpreters, Baruch Spinoza, Richard Simon, not Richard Simon, Richard Simon, he's French, and Johann Salomo Semler, a Jew, a Catholic, and a Protestant respectively, who began to apply some of these Enlightenment approaches to the Bible. But it's not until the 19th century when the Enlightenment really comes to a head within biblical interpretation. Again, we want to keep in mind what's going on in the rest of the world. Europe is in turmoil really for the whole century. All of this eventually explodes into World War I. Moreover, Pius IX, who was Pope for much of the mid-19th century, loses his land. He loses the Papal States. And so there's a defensiveness that rises, especially within Catholic circles during this era. However, applied to the Bible, some of that skepticism is warranted. Ferdinand Christian Bauer proposed that there was a sharp distinction between Petrine, that is Jewish Christian theology, versus Pauline Gentile theology. Around the same time, you have David Friedrich Strauss, who began the Old Quest, at least that's what it's usually called today, the Old Quest for the historical Jesus. Both of these scholars were rationalists. They sought to skim out all of the miraculous, all of the supernatural from the Bible. They wanted a purely rational understanding of sacred scripture. A little less pernicious, but still more on the rationalist side, was the landmark work of Julius Wellhausen. We're going to hear that name again when we study the Pentateuch. Julius Wellhausen was the one, this is what he's most famous for, he also worked on the Gospels, but he's most famous for individuating the classic four sources of the Pentateuch, J, E, D, and P. We'll talk more about that theory in Pentateuch class, but he's the one who differentiated between these four sources and gave it its classical expression. There's much criticism to be made of Wellhausen's, at least some of the contours of Wellhausen's theory, but it's very important and it's developing towards the end of the 19th century. Also, and very important, Hermann Gunkel, really at the dawn of the 20th century, explores literary forms or literary genres within the Hebrew Bible. His work will be landmark, especially in the books of Genesis and the Psalms. Then we move into the 20th century, and a few other things happen on the broader world stage. World War II, especially with the Holocaust, forces Christians to think about how they portray Jews, how they've understood Judaism as portrayed in the Bible. This forced Christians to ask some very uncomfortable questions. Also very important, the Dead Sea Scrolls. That discovery revolutionized our understanding of the world in which Jesus lived. And during this period, we have the scholars Rudolf Bultmann, also somebody who sought to skim miracles out of his biblical interpretation, but applied the study of literary forms, literary genres within the Gospels, a most influential scholar even with his problems. William Foxwell Albright was a famous biblical archaeologist, sought to situate the biblical narratives within their history as we can discern from the physical remains of the ancient world. And Brevard Childs, who taught at Yale, wanted to return to a reading of the entire biblical canon. He gave rise to what we call canonical criticism. And in the second half of the 20th century, especially after Vatican II, Catholic interpreters begin to come back and make large international impacts on the exegetical stage. And so now as we return back to our 6 major themes, you'll notice that the modern era posed questions to each one. We do well to keep these in mind as we begin in our next class to look at how the magisterium responded to all these modern developments. For now, we should at least notice the tendencies that begin to emerge within Christianity in the 19th century. In Protestant circles, some were quite happy to go along with this new rationalism that's usually called liberal Protestantism, whereas there was a reaction, especially in the early 20th century, called fundamentalism. This is the original meaning of fundamentalism, that is fidelity to the 5 so-called fundamentals. Catholicism had its own version of this between modernism and traditionalism. We will explore this in greater detail in our next class. Until then, read well and pray well.